What if I told you that King Nebuchadnezzar built a gate that has a picture of a dinosaur on it? Let's start with the Ishtar Gate. This gate is really a marvel of the ancient world. It was built in the 6th century BC by King Nebuchadnezzar II. Now, y'all may recognize King Nebuchadnezzar because he's the one who's mentioned in the Bible as conquering the city of Jerusalem. The Ishtar Gate was part of a grand processional of gates leading into the heart of Babylon. The outer surface of the gate are made from these highly glazed bricks that are in this brilliant blue. And along the edges, there are intricately carved animals in relief. Now, a lot of these carved animals are the sort of animals that we're familiar with. So there's lions, there's bulls, but there's one animal that is different from all the rest. This creature has a long neck and a scaly torso. It has a forked tongue flicking the air and a horn sticking out of its head. This creature has a long meandering tail, the front paws of a lion, and the back claws of an eagle. In English, the name of this creature has come down to us as the Sirrush. This is a very loose translation of the Akkadian word for splendor serpent. Now, Ishtar's Gate was discovered by us modern folks in the year 1902 in present-day Iraq. The head archaeologist was a German man named Robert Koldewey. Now, after examining the Sirrush on the gate, he reached a startling conclusion. He concluded that the Sirrush is not only based on an actual animal, but that animal was a dinosaur, specifically an iguanodon. Now, most mainstream archaeologists did not take this iguanodon theory too seriously, but some folks in the cryptozoology community, most especially William Levy and Bernard Heuvelmans, took this idea and ran with it. And the theory that the Sirrush is based on a dinosaur, or at the very least an actual creature, persists to this day. Okay, Brian, the Sirrush, is it real? Is it a dinosaur? What's going on there?
I think it could have been a dinosaur.
Okay, so you think it was a dinosaur. Well, let's go through it. What are your reasons?
All right, so first reason, as you already mentioned in your overview, in the Ishtar Gate, we already have recognized that there's two real animals on there, the ox and the lion. So stands to reason that the third animal would also be real. Another good point that Koldewey had suggested is that because the depictions of the Sirrush is so consistent throughout Babylonian history, it's a good indicator that this was a real animal walking around at the time. In contrast to that, some of the mythical creatures throughout Babylon history were not so consistent, but the Sirrush remained a consistent creature throughout its history.
Yeah, that makes sense, that a real animal or something based on a real animal is going to be more consistent than something that's totally imaginary. All right, so you mentioned that you think it's a dinosaur. What kind of dinosaur do you think it was?
Yeah, the most popular dinosaur is the iguanodon, as you have mentioned before. That one, when you look it up, you will see that it does really resemble what is on the Ishtar Gate. So that one would make sense. The other one that I've heard thrown around there is that it could be some kind of sauropod that was possibly imported into Babylon from Central Africa.
And that concept of importing a dinosaur from Central Africa is one I want to talk about in another show. Yeah, and let me start with the iguanodon, because that was the one that Koldewey originally suggested. And when he did this, that made a lot of sense. If you look at the forelegs of the iguanodon, they look a lot like a lion. And if you look at the back legs, they look clawed, sort of like an eagle. And back when Koldewey made this proposal back in 1918, it was thought that the iguanodon also had a horn on its head. But later paleontologists figured out that that horn actually went on its thumbs. So that's been a sticking point for me with the iguanodon now. How would you explain that?
So my explanation would be no one's actually seen an iguanodon. So how do we know if it...
Oh, fair enough.
Obviously, I'm no paleontologist. I will give the experts their space, but nobody's actually seen an iguanodon. So in theory, we don't know if they did have some kind of horn, maybe like a flap of skin, something that could resemble a horn of some kind.
The hypothetical horned iguanodon.
Or flapped of skin iguanodon.
And another explanation that some folks have proposed was that, the iguanodon or whatever other dinosaur it may have been wasn't necessarily running around the streets of Babylon at that time, but instead, maybe it had gone extinct, several centuries before, and someone's great 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 grandfather saw an iguanodon. Well, in that case, it would be reasonable to have some sort of mythic additions throughout time. So, like, some horns get added, something else fanciful gets added. So there are other explanations for this horn.
Another argument for there are actually some descriptions of the Sirrush. One of the most famous ones is in the Apocrypha extension of the book of Daniel in the Bible, which is known as Bel and the Dragon, or Bel and the Behemoth. So this is one topic that we kind of want to do a deep dive in on a later show, but
Yes.
just a brief overview. Essentially, Nebuchadnezzar presents the dragon to Daniel that they are keeping captive and feeding to present to him as their living god. And Daniel then proceeds to kill the dragon in proof that this is not a god, his god is the living god. But again, it's very brief description of the Sirrush, and it does line up with what we know the Babylonians described as the Sirrush in their images, like on the Ishtar Gate.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right that I think Bel and the Dragon deserves its own future episode. But to your point, there are other references in like Babylonian literature where this seems to be presented as an actual living animal.
Yeah, and going on top of that too with other pieces of literature, another place in the Bible in Job chapter 40, it also describes the behemoth, which a lot of people have described as possibly being like a type of sauropod. So just other areas in the Bible and different areas in literature where these type of creatures could have been referenced. I know.
And I want to do a behemoth episode too. So many future episodes here.
The last point I want to make on this being a dinosaur / dragon is just the appearance of dragons throughout cultures around the world. This is another one I'm hoping we can do another deep dive on, but just how every single culture around the world has descriptions of dragons that are all in the same vein of the Sirrush. So that just being another point of reference that this is not just an isolated incident in one part of the world. There are stories of these type of creatures throughout the world.
And I want to do episodes on like all of them. All right, so now I'll sort of put my cards on the table here, and I will say that I think it is unlikely that the Sirrush is based on a dinosaur. Not impossible, but unlikely. And there are a few reasons for this. The first reason is I think that some of the evidence presented in favor of the Sirrush doesn't do the work that its proponents think it does. So let's take the example of the Ishtar Gate. It has been mentioned before that the other animals on the gate are real, and that is true. But there's only two other types of animals there, right? There's the lion, there's like this ox bull thing called the auroch, and then there's the Sirrush. And in that context, I don't think it's that crazy to have two real animals and a mythical animal. I'll give you kind of a silly example. The coat of arms of the United Kingdom. It has a lion and a unicorn. I don't think the fact that a lion's on there would suggest that the unicorn's real, right? You can have mythical and real animals mixed together.
Why can't unicorns be real?
Okay.
Whoa!
Also, I think a lot of the dinosaur candidates that have been presented for the Sirrush don't quite hold muster. So you mentioned the sauropods, you mentioned the iguanodons, and I do see some resemblance there. But I do think the fact that, like, sauropods didn't have horns, or iguanodons didn't have horns, or, what do we do with, like, the bird feet? I do think those are issues. Also, just more fundamentally, balancing the prior probabilities. What's more likely? That some sort of relic population of dinosaurs is able to survive and was seen by the ancient Babylonians, or that this was a mythical creature that happened to be more consistent in art over time than most mythical creatures? I think the latter is more likely.
Counterpoint to what you just said, Matt. If you're coming from the perspective that I come from as a young Earth creationist, it would make perfect sense for a remnant of a dinosaur to make it into Babylon. being relatively close to the flood, it would make sense that there could be some remnants of dinosaurs still walking around with people.
And that's a fair point. If you are on the young Earth side like you, then that does readjust the probability. So I do grant that. But even if you're on the older Earth side like me, it's still possible for dinosaurs to survive, right? You see creatures from the dinosaur times that have survived that we all acknowledge, like the coelacanth, even things like, crabs, jellyfish. Lots of things have done that. But I do grant your point that from the young Earth perspective, that the probabilities are adjusted. But just so you don't think I'm being the lame stick in the mud here, I have my own candidate for the Sirrush. Have you ever heard of the sivatherium?
No, I have not.
Sivatheriums are amazing. They're now extinct, but they're related to the okapi and the giraffe, same family. Picture them as looking a little bit like an okapi, but bigger, so 7 feet at the shoulder and with a longer neck. Now, in addition to that, they also had very long horn-like protrusions on its head. Now, the sivatherium was found throughout northern Africa and Asia, so same region as Babylon, and was believed to be relatively common. There's also reason to believe that the sivatherium may have gone extinct really recently, as few as a few thousand years ago. Now, that last part is controversial. It's based on an interpretation of some pretty ambiguous cave paintings, but suffice to say there is reason to believe that the sivatherium was around relatively recently. Recently enough to be seen in ancient Babylon, or at the very least to be seen by the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of whoever built the Ishtar Gate in Babylon. Or maybe they just found the bones of this sivatherium and put it together and came up with their own explanation. Now, this is not a perfect explanation. The biggest problem is that the sivatherium had hooves. So I don't really have a good explanation for why the Sirrush had the lion paws and the eagle claws instead of hooves.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting theory, Matt.
Yeah, not quite as interesting as the dinosaur theory, but I would say pretty darn close. Now let's transition to our sort of closing conclusions here. I still think the most likely explanation is that the Sirrush is simply a mythical creature. But I do think that the sivatherium is plausible. And, it's frankly the one I'm rooting for. Brian, what are your conclusions here?
As I've said, my opinion, most likely a dinosaur. Some of the problems with that, like we've talked about, where are the horns? Some of the feet problems. But again, my vote would be a dinosaur of some kind.
All right. Well, I'm glad we could get that whole debate settled. By the way, viewers, if you like this content and want to share it with others, please like the video. Just give that a little click. We really appreciate it.
And don't forget to hit that subscribe button.